Even after the sinking, the killing went on for those of us who survived and got onto rafts. Anyone starting to panic was thrown off into the sea. When they scrambled to get back on, they were kicked away. Men pushed under and held under Japanese survivors. Fighting broke out as the animal instinct to survive asserted itself, making some survivors try to capture more seaworthy vessels and shove others off to their deaths. Many gave up, already so weak, dangerously dehydrated and ill. Frequently they had been injured too in the sinking. Many gulped salt water and quickly went stark raving mad, drowning themselves to end the torment. Horrible as it may sound, as men became mad, they had to be shoved off the rafts or boats, or the remainder might have perished. There was a lot of shouting and screaming, cries of "Get off, you bastard, or I'll kill you," made me close my eyes in distress. Most of the shouts were in English. There were not many Japanese, the majority of whom had got off early in lifeboats. Drowning and dying men called for their wives, their children, or mothers. Men said things like, "Daddy will be home soon," and then disappeared beneath the waves. It was harrowing to hear. By that stage, most of us were treading a very fine line between sanity and madness. That is an excerpt from a book called The Forgotten Highlander about a fella named Alistair Urquhart. He was a Scottish-born British soldier, so he was fighting in World War II with the British military, and this guy has one of the most insane lives I've ever heard of. I mean, you'll hear about it soon enough, but that was an excerpt from when he was a prisoner of war under the control of the Japanese, the Imperial Japanese in World War II. He had been a prisoner of war for like 3 years. Then he gets put on a thing called a hell ship, which we'll get into what that is. That ship gets shot down by American submarines. Then he's alone at sea. And so that's the excerpt that we just read. But his story doesn't even end there, which is absolutely incredible. All that to say, there's a ton of lessons here. A phenomenal life that's worth studying. We're going to go ahead and get right into it. So he was from Scotland. Aberdeen, I believe, is where he's from. His father was in the military as well when he was a kid, and he remembers basically growing up realizing that his dad had a traumatic experience in the military. It was not like it lived with him for his entire life. The quote, the note I have here that says, "Father and son. The Gordons had lost 9,000 men. The Gordon Highlanders, that's why it's called the Forgotten Highlander. The Gordon Highlanders is like the regiment or the military group that he became a part of. They were pretty renowned in that area. The Gordons had lost 9,000 men in the First World War and suffered a further 20,000 casualties. Every family in the northeast of Scotland had been affected. Now I was taking the same road my father had taken all those years before. His journey had led him straight to the gates of hell, to the Battle of the Somme, where Britain's PALS battalions were decimated and the army suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day. Battle of the Somme is one of the most gory, violent battles that's probably ever happened in the world, and maybe even the most. I mean, a lot of people died, that's for sure. So that had an impact on his father, and so he grew up with this impact and this perception of the military that it's like a very serious endeavor and it's not like a positive experience. It definitely affected his dad's personality, and I think he was conscripted, so it wasn't like he was choosing. I think he got drafted into the military. And yeah, so he was a very outgoing kid, or active kid, into ballroom dancing. And a little note here, the note is Hazel, because this character Hazel, who's a young lady that he ends up dancing with, is a important figure. I just want to take note of that at the beginning because it's a really cool storyline, and she is a regular part of his life, or a regular part of his time as a prisoner of war. She becomes a very important part of his survival. Okay, so long story short, he goes to Singapore, which was then a British-controlled outpost, you could say, it was a prominent place for them. It was in a really strong position. They thought it was well fortified. But throughout the first part of this book, the number one lesson that you're going to get when you read it, or even in this podcast, and the lesson that I got, is the British were utterly unprepared and arrogant as they could possibly be as it relates to the preparation for the Japanese. They thought Singapore was impregnable, They thought the Japanese were an inferior fighting force, and I'll get into some notes here in a second about like how they actually describe them, which are pretty funny. But here's a little example. Here's a couple examples of how underprepared they are. Finally, at the end of the 45-minute journey, we arrived at Selarang, the home of the 2nd Battalion of the Gordon Highlanders. I noticed immediately that the fencing did not extend all the way around the barracks, and it seemed a rather sleepy haven. So they didn't even finish the fencing around their fort or around their barracks. Like that's example number one. Number two, the dining room had been decorated with festive bunting, and there was a cracker for each man. All of us enjoyed the atmosphere, and it was probably the most euphoric we had been for weeks. But less than 100 miles north of the equator, the temperature was well into the 90s, and it did feel strange to enjoy festivities without being wrapped up in woolly jumpers and scarves. It was my first Christmas away from home and will be my last celebration for 6 long years. So they're celebrating Christmas as if they're like totally fine, and they're not like in the midst, or at least at the beginning, or facing any type of opposition. The note I have is, what about war? Like, these guys are supposed to be in the military in a far off place, and they're having Christmas celebrations as if they're back home in Scotland or Britain. Here's another example. Bizarrely, each day between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., the whole camp came to a standstill for a compulsory siesta. Every man had to be in his bunk during that period. I disagreed with this from the start. The enemy seemed unlikely to suspend hostilities to allow us time to rest during the hottest part of the day. One's body gets accustomed to the habit of daily routine. It was hardly suitable training for jungle warfare, but our superiors thought differently. This ridiculous routine, a hangover from the Raj, was fairly typical of the complacency that served the British so badly in Singapore. So, the lesson there for me is you can't get too high on your horse. Britain was the huge empire in the world. They thought very, very low of the Japanese. They thought they were an inferior fighting force. They thought they were like practically inadequate. They thought that they had never fought like any real battles. The Britain newspapers were saying things like Singapore is impregnable. It's a fortress. Basically like lifting it up and making it seem like it's not even a question that they could be attacked, or that they could be taken over at least. So the lesson is that the British didn't take any active preparation steps. They didn't actually do anything to make sure that they were all right. They got lazy, they got complacent, they got way too arrogant and prideful, and it ends up biting them in the ass. And you're about to learn here how that is the case. But here's a little funny description that they had of the Japanese. It was inconceivable that the greatest empire the world had known could be defeated by little yellow men who had poor eyesight and could not see in the dark. All kinds of mumbo-jumbo was repeated in relation to the Japanese and their alleged weaknesses. We were told they were inferior soldiers and had only ever fought other inadequates like the Chinese. We were even told that their pilots were hopeless because they had a poor sense of balance, owing to their being carried on their mothers' backs as babies. We would soon learn the hard way. So, interesting, right? Extremely arrogant position by the Brits, did not prepare properly, and it's all building up to what you're about to learn. Here's one more note about Hazel. I'm gonna kind of point to her as a through line throughout this entire story, because they were dating, or like sort of mildly seeing each other prior to him leaving when he was a young man and she was a young lady. And to the book, I wrote occasionally to my old pal Eric, who had joined up with the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and also to Hazel Watson, the girl I danced with before I left. On days of extreme boredom, I would think of Hazel, who seemed to become more attractive and intelligent with every day and every mile that passed between us. So, he's in Singapore. They're underprepared. They start to hear more murmurs. The World War II is going on in Europe at the time. I believe Britain is being bombarded. I think the Battle of London, where German bombers are basically just bombing the crap out of London, is going on. So they know that there's like something's amiss. The world is not in a stable environment. I don't believe the Japanese at this point had made it explicit that they were going to set or wage war against the West and modern countries as well, but they had an idea. And so basically what they realized, that the Japanese started taking over islands and do different things across the Southeast Asia and things of that sort, and they started hearing little murmurs of it. And here's an example. The fighting was getting closer to Singapore all the time. So were the atrocities. On 22nd January 1942, after fierce fighting at the village of Perit Sulong in Johari, retreating Australians were forced to leave behind their wounded. What followed became the first of many atrocities against Allied prisoners. The Japanese general Takuma Nishimura ordered them killed, and his subordinates gleefully obliged, bayoneting, drowning, and burning alive the wounded. So they're starting to hear these murmurs of like, holy cow, this is a pretty evil, this Japanese army is not the British army. British army has respect for prisoners of war. They follow the Geneva Convention, and they're all of a sudden hearing about this like mass, very dark, very terrific, or terrorizing rather, but very terrorizing, very horrifying army that is the Japanese Imperial Army. So they start to hear these murmurs, and it's getting closer to Singapore, and then a little bit of angst is building up, as you can imagine. So they start to hear more and more evil stories of the Japanese, which is adding to the angst. This is interesting. So, simply put, the Japanese quite literally just walk through Singapore. As you can guess by what I already said, they were so underprepared and so arrogant that the Japanese practically literally docked Singapore, beached at Singapore, and then just like walked through it and took over, I think, 100,000, 120,000. So to the book, the note here is the worst moment of my life. As we stood there in the blazing sun without food, water, or shelter, the horrible reality broke over me in sickening, depressing waves. I was part of Britain's greatest military disaster ever. A captive, just like some 120,000 others captured in the Battle of Malaya. I was a prisoner. It was a gut-wrenching realization to think that my liberty was gone and no telling for how long it would be so. I kept a brave face on for the boys, whose eyes were on stalks, but who stayed mute. This was the worst moment of my life. So just think about that. You were a free man for 19 years of your life, or 20 maybe. You lived the way that you wanted to. You're hearing all these evil atrocities that are being performed by the Japanese Imperial Army. And all of a sudden, here you are, you're at the beck and call. Basically, you're a slave to these people now. The exact same people you've been hearing these atrocities about. You lost all your freedom, and basically he begins to think that he's just going to die. Like he thinks he's going to be massacred in a similar way that these other soldiers are going to get massacred, which is interesting. One thing that's interesting to note is I just finished another book called Endurance about Ernest Shackleton, who just a remarkable story of grit and resilience and the power of the human spirit and the human will, where he basically gets trapped in Antarctica with like 28 members of his expedition. And in that story, and this story, which is a story of resilience, it's a very similar story in terms of the lessons. In John D. Rockefeller and Teddy Roosevelt, a through line is hope. There is a lot of messaging and reflections on hope and the importance of it, especially when it comes to moving forward in the face of difficulties. And throughout this story, there's a lot of little anecdotes of hope. So like this one example, I won't read the whole thing, but basically the Japanese guards got a little bored and they left or something while they were guarding him, and then the prisoners of war just had a quick church service, and it provides hope. They sang a little song. It wasn't a big deal in the scheme of things. It's only like a few minutes in relation to their amount of time in captivity, but little things like that strung along give you hope. They give you a little bit of a reminder that you still have free will. You still have the ability to act in an unbroken manner and with a full spirit and not a non-broken spirit. You're not completely at the control of these tyrants. So it's just interesting. It's something I've taken note of. The word hope comes up a lot in these powerful stories of resilience. This note says, lonely, isolated, and sad. The lack of contact from our families also got us down. Men wondered how their families were surviving the bombing of British cities. If sons and brothers have been conscripted, the lack of letters from home made us feel like a forgotten army, and we were anxious that our families knew we were okay. In June, the Japanese had allowed us to send a message home. I had filled in my little card with the message, "My dearest mother, I am in good health and spirits and being well treated. Hope you are well. Much love to all at home. Please do not worry too much. Please let Hazel know and give her my love. With all my love, Alistair. But we never knew whether the cards had been sent or not. In fact, I was to send a total of 6 cards during my captivity, and all of them arrived in Aberdeen after my return home. By now, every prisoner was suffering from depression and coping with Black Dog. And coping with Black Dog was the hardest thing a prisoner ever encountered. So that's depression. Black Dog is depression. It's angst, worry, fear, doubt. This is also a through line in a lot of these stories. The battle is internal in a lot of these cases. Same with Teddy Roosevelt. He battled with depression. John D. Rockefeller battled with depression. This is obviously in Alistair Urquhart's book. He battled with depression. Ernest Shackleton's crew in Endurance, they battled with depression. So a lot of these stories, these guys that accomplish these great things, it's just part of the calling of these men is to learn how to battle with these forces, what he refers to as Black Dog, and he'll get into this more. Basically, he's a prisoner of war with the Japanese, and they kind of keep him at this place for a little bit where they don't do much, and he, the whole time that he's there, basically just thinks they're going to get massacred, not sure what's going on. And the Japanese basically say, oh, wow, you've been selected to go to a special holiday camp. And he's skeptical at first, obviously, but they're like, yeah, you'll get to rest 3 days and work 3 days, and you'll get more food and better, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, okay, well, I don't think this is true, but let's see what happens. All that to say, very similar to the promises that the Germans were giving resettlements, Jewish families in resettlement areas in Europe, they did not go to a holiday camp. Let's just say that. They ended up going on the Death March, which is absolutely an insane journey from where they were in like Selarong or wherever they were. They went up to, I think, somewhere in Thailand. But this march, absolutely ridiculous. They went on like a march across or down a path where there was these Chinese people that were beheaded, and it's not funny, but they were beheaded and they were basically lined all the way down this path. So these malnourished, sick, very sad, very depressed, lonely, isolated prisoners of war from Scotland, Britain, America, Canada, and Australia are marching for like 36 hours at a time, hours and hours and hours. And they're just walking past these dead bodies or these heads that are decapitated, sticking up on sticks right by them. So it's just this torturous, gruesome march. Then they get to a train car or a train railroad, and arguably even worse than the march, the train. So basically the way that this goes, I'll explain it quickly. They were in a train car, and this is in the tropics, so it's the metal in the train car is extremely hot during the day. They would pack them so tightly that there was not enough space to sit down or lay down or kneel or anything. So these guys who had just walked all this way had to basically stand up in a trail car with no airflow because they shut the doors. That's steaming hot, probably like 100 degrees. Everybody's already got like dysentery and diarrhea, so people are pooping, peeing, throwing up on themselves. People are dying. People are bleeding. And there's nowhere to go, and it's so tightly crammed. It's like sardines in a can. Like there's nowhere for them to go. And I think they do this for 5 days. So it's just absolutely atrocious. Here's a note where they're in the train cars. Day became night. I leaned against the wagon sides once they'd cooled down sufficiently and tried to sleep. It was hopeless. It sounds bizarre, but I think I was too tired to sleep. Still, no one spoke. It was just too much effort. I felt doomed and resigned myself to death. It would have been a blessing. I considered suicide and began to fantasize that the train would jump its tracks and that I would be killed swiftly without any more suffering. I was so delirious and out of my head that I willed the Royal Air Force to drop bombs on us and end our misery that way. Later in the page, I was at my absolute breaking point. Looking back now, more than 60 years later, I wonder how we possibly got through it. We were all out of our minds. Great hulking men keened and wept like mourning mothers. Others had whispered private prayers over and over. I lay my head resting on a stranger's boot, ready to die. So throughout the thing, they realized they couldn't stand for the entirety of this trip. So they were literally like laying on top of each other, like packed in like literal sardines, laying on top of each other's poop, throw up, blood, pee. It was just disgusting. And so this is just the journey to where they're going. That was called the Death March. Then they basically get to what's called the Death Railway. And the Death Railway, pretty insane ordeal. They were basically building a railway for the Japanese army from Thailand to Burma or something like that, so that the Japanese could supply their forces that were then eventually going to attack India or something of the sort, but not super important. Here's a little note. So sometimes, this is an interesting perspective. Sometimes we think of uncertainty as a complete negative. Like it's risk, it's anxiety. It brings about anxiety. It's scary. And we think about it as like, oh, wow, we need to like kind of either lean into it or whatnot. But this is interesting because on day one of his time in captivity, which he would spend 750 days at this particular place in the jungle, he says, it was a long first day. And if I had realized then that it was just the first of 750 days, I would have, if I had realized then that it was the first of 750 days I would spend as a slave in the jungle, I would have broken down and cried like a baby. So sometimes when we're in something that we're not sure how long it's going to be, that's God's way of protecting us. Because if we knew how long it was going to be, we'd give up or we'd quit because we think that we couldn't do it. So I just found that to be an interesting thing. He kind of relished, upon reflecting about this time in his life, he relished and appreciated the fact that he did not know that this was going to be 2 years, 2.5 years, whatever it was. So interesting perspective on uncertainty. Okay, so here's a little bit about the Death Railway. The construction of the Death Railway was one of the greatest war crimes of the 20th century. It was said that one man died for every sleeper laid. Sleepers, I'm pretty sure, are the things that are laid like horizontally or perpendicular to the track. Certainly over 16,000 of us British, Australian, Dutch, American, and Canadian prisoners died on the railway, murdered by the ambitions of the Japanese Imperial Army to complete the lifeline to their forces in Burma by December 1943. Up to 100,000 native slaves, Thais, Indians, Malayans, and Tamils also died in atrocious circumstances. So this over 100,000 people died in a couple of years by trying to build this railway. And you have to think, these guys are malnourished. They basically eat 1 cup of rice per day, and they're building a railway. It's absolutely insane. This one says rock bottom. By the end of the day, we had still managed only a distance of 20 feet, but we had finally dug to the depth the engineers wanted, and just before dusk, we wound our weary bodies back through the jungle to camp. I got my rice and water and went straight to the hut and collapsed, my whole body aching with pain. Hands, feet, back, arms, legs were all so sore, especially my back and legs. Eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, I fell asleep, but when I woke, it didn't feel like I had slept at all. I was incredibly lethargic, and the pain had increased overnight. I was expecting a long sleep to rejuvenate me, to help me through the next day, which I had envisaged as bringing just the same amount of torture, if not worse. But I felt horrific, and that is when I realized I was at rock bottom. So you just got to imagine, I don't know. It's they're eating a bowl of rice with water twice a day. So pretty much protein and fat, it's non-existent. The rice has maggots and lice and all this crazy bug stuff in it. They're all sick with dysentery, cholera, beriberi, tropical ulcers, all this stuff. And then they're forced to do manual labor for 16 hours a day. It's just absolutely asinine. It's insane to me that the human spirit could even maintain that level of work with that level of nutrition. I think it's an incredible indication of the power of the human spirit. Here's a note on the tropical ulcers that I just mentioned, just how disgusting this is. This is maybe a little gruesome for some of you. Everybody suffered from tropical ulcers, which, as far as I understand, is basically like on your calves, feet, shins, and things like that. Your skin starts to just get rotten away. And so the way that they would heal these or handle them medically, they would sharpen dessert spoons and then scoop out the dead flesh. That's one way. The other way was by going to the latrine where people pooped and picking up maggots out of the excrement, counting how many maggots. So let's say you grab 4, 5, 6 maggots. 6 maggots, you put them in your rotting flesh so that the maggots then eat away the rotting flesh, and then you take the maggots out. And so that's how they heal themselves with these tropical ulcers. How crazy is that? Absolutely disgusting. But that's what they had to do, so they did it. The note I have here is purpose. This is a meta lesson of this book. There was not much to chat about. Although a lot of men were married and would talk about their families back home, these slightly older men in their 30s and 40s seemed to survive in much greater numbers. Surprisingly, it was the young men who died first on the railway. Perhaps the older ones were strong enough emotionally. Perhaps with families they had more to live for. I sometimes wondered if I would die without having a family and without having had the chance to live a life, and then quickly try to banish these thoughts before getting my head down. So that's just interesting. These people with families, they had more to live for. And so he noticed that they were living longer, and they were surviving more in larger numbers on the railway as slaves. So I think that's an interesting insight into the importance of family and the power of family, the power of having something that's bigger than just yourself to live for. Whereas these young men who don't have families, no wives, etc., they don't have that same gravitational pull from their home because they don't have a young kid or a young daughter or a young son or a young wife waiting for them. And actually, these 2 pages probably contain the 2 most important lessons of the book for me. To the book, I knew people were dying around me on the railway, but I didn't really want to know. It was too dispiriting. It was difficult to judge the full toll of casualties, and by this stage I had become so self-obsessed in a true mental battle just to get through the day. I had very few friends at Hellfire Pass, and most of us were the same. We all worked so hard that just trying to survive, each person became more and more insular as it became more difficult. It required a superhuman effort to make it to the end of each day. Strangely, the less we talked to each other, the more we talked to ourselves. Nearly all the prisoners talked to themselves, and I was no exception. Every morning I would tell myself over and over, survive this day, survive this day, survive this day. And that's the note that I wrote down. I said, survive this day, because he wasn't thinking about 2 years from then when he got out, or 2 months from then, or 5 years, or whenever he was going to get married or have kids. He was in hell, and the only way you get through hell is by surviving that day. He had to survive that day. I also think, so there's a couple notes there. Number one, just the importance of self-talk and actually reminding himself, like every single day, he had to remind himself that today is the only thing that matters. I have to get through today, and then tomorrow I'll worry about tomorrow. But today, there's a verse in the Bible, I can't remember exactly what it says, but today contains enough problems. Shall not worry about tomorrow either. Only today is what's important. It's a very important lesson, especially for anybody like myself who's been through peaks and valleys, which is literally anybody who lives in those troughs. It's very common, I believe, for people when they're depressed or in troughs or sorrowful to think, because the mind and the devil plays tricks on you, I've always been this way and I always will be. When you're in those troughs, I just think it's such an important reminder to survive this day, survive this day, survive this day. Make one day better than yesterday. Make today better than yesterday. It doesn't matter how it happens. Do whatever you say that you're going to do. Eat healthy. Whatever it needs to do. Call somebody, laugh. Make today better than yesterday. Survive this day, and tomorrow will bring about enough worries of its own, and you can deal with that when it comes. But survive this day is absolutely something that I think we should all hammer into our minds from this book, from this story, because if he can survive the days that he was living, we can 100% survive the days that we are as well, and will. Another note on depression. By this time, mental health had become a major issue on the railway. We all suffered from depression. Men were taking their own lives. All along the railway, men cut their own throats, put their heads on the railway line, and simply walked into the jungle to die. Many developed the Atap stare and just looked intently at the thatched roof of the hut. Death soon followed. Others went mad because of medical conditions caused by vitamin deficiencies, and some just gave up, losing their minds and their self-control. They would fight with anyone over nothing at all, throwing punches, biting, and kicking. So, as you can imagine, pretty desolate feeling, pretty tragic environment that they're living in. You can't blame any of these guys for becoming depressed or even suicidal. I mean, it's literally it's the lowest form of humanity. Like they were treated as if there was no humanity at all. So it's just interesting to see how different people dealt with it, and some people killed themselves, some people didn't, some people just gave up. It's interesting, but it's hard to blame these guys. This is a note that I said prayer. So, okay, at this point, he's got beriberi. He's battling at any given time. Dysentery, which is basically diarrhea and all that stuff. Cholera, which is killing a lot of people. Beriberi, which is like a vitamin deficiency thing that makes your joints and stuff hurt, I believe. Tropical ulcers, which I mentioned is like rotting skin. And now you got kidney stones. So the note is prayer. Kidney stones tortured me for the next few years as a prisoner of war. The pain was so bad that I started to pray. The first time I'd ever leant on God's ear in earnest. Even though I had to attend Bible class with the Boy Scouts, I never believed in a divine entity and was especially skeptical since I was forced to go to the classes. Gradually, the more I suffered and the more evils I witnessed, the more I began to believe. I turned to God several times. Often, I felt my prayers went unanswered. But I somehow lived through this madness, and I think that someone must have been listening. Interesting how God can use tough times to break people down to the point where they'll reach out to him and begin seeking a relationship with him. Okay, so there's this thing called a black hole. This is basically a box of metal that the Japanese would dig like 3 feet into the ground. So it's half subterranean, half above the ground. Black corrugated metal gets extremely hot, like the trail cars that we spoke about earlier. No food, or maybe there was like a little bit of food and a little bit of water each day, but you're completely isolated. You're just sitting in this box, and the really messed up and torturous thing about it is it's perfect size to not be able to lay down, to not be able to stand up, and to not be able to kneel. So you're kind of just contorted in this really small box for like an extended period of time. He gets put in it at some point. I don't know if it's right here. It's a little bit later, I believe. But so he talks about this black hole. He ends up getting put in the black hole for like 7 days or something because a Japanese officer tried to sexually assault him and he wouldn't oblige his advances. He was like, no, I'm not going to perform these sexual acts on you. And as a way of punishing him for not doing that, the guy puts him in the black hole, which is just crazy. It's just an evil thing to do. This is a really tragic little excerpt here. I just found it to affect me pretty positively. It just makes you think about war in general. It's pretty crazy. For a change, I entered through the back entrance of the hut and noticed a chap from my work party lying alone in his bed space. "Hello, Bill," I said to him as I crouched down. He was from Northampton and had left his newlywed wife back in England after joining the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire regiment. I normally spoke very little on the railway, but Bill had a friendly face, and we were always exchanging quiet words while working. "Hey, Bill, it's me, Alistair." He looked at me and tried to speak, but nothing came out. I could tell that he was suffering from an acute strain of malaria. Through the fear in his eyes, I could see that he was dying. I sat down beside him and took his hand. It was sticky but cool. His breath was labored, life fading from him. I stayed with Bill all night. I nursed him the best I could, giving him some rice and most of my water. As the night wore on, he began losing consciousness. He was away with the ferries, and by 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., he was gone. Holding his hand, I felt it go limp. He twitched for some time after he passed away. When it stopped, I fetched the medical orderly and left. When I returned, he was gone. It's tragic insight, man. These people were young men just like us. They had lives to live. They had wives at home who had not yet mothered or birthed their children. They had potential. They had 50, 60 years of life left, God willing, to experience the felicities and the tragedies of life. And this war took that away from them. It's remarkable. I also think that it's very illuminating into the type of person that Alistair was, and many other people like him, that Alistair was in the midst of his own battle for survival. You already know how sick and deprived and malnourished and weak that he was. Here he is giving his dying friend his rice and his water. Talk about a powerful notion or a powerful act. That's love right there. That is love in action, which I really believe love is in action. And that's like, what better example of actual love to a fellow human being, fellow brother, than to give him your food and your water when you're just as close to dying as he is. It's phenomenal. It's an extreme example of generosity. Yeah, so goes in the black hole. That's after spoke with this Bill guy who was passing away. This is interesting. So, as a way to sort of make themselves feel powerful, they would do these little sabotage things, and I think it's just interesting to note it's a way for them to feel like they're still free, because like they can exercise a little bit of free will. And so, to the book, instead we made constant attempts at sabotage. Men whispered orders to impair the construction of the bridge wherever possible. Some charged with making up concrete mixtures deliberately added too much sand or not enough, which would later have disastrous effects. We collected huge number of termites and white ants and deposited them into the grooves and joints of load-bearing trunks. Out of sight of the guards, I furtively sawed halfway through wooden bolts wherever possible, hoping they would snap whenever any serious weight like a train was placed on them. So, if you've ever heard of the movie The Bridge on the River Kwai, so they start on the Death Railway, then they end up building this thing along the River Kwai, and they build this bridge, very famous bridge over the River Kwai, like the movie. And it's just interesting to me, this group of soldiers who are basically as low as human beings can get, they still found it within themselves to make a little bit of, to sabotage a little bit, because it gave them this sort of unbroken, their spirit was strengthened by these little acts of conniving sabotage. And I find that to be very interesting. They just needed a little bit of it. They just needed a little bit. And here's a little interesting thing. So he was suffering from cholera, which almost killed him. The note I have is love and romanticism and Hazel. So he is literally about to die. And to the book, I was only half compos mentis and just wanted to sleep, but the orderlies kept tapping my cheeks to keep me awake and engaged me in conversation to keep my mind and soul engaged. They found the dog-eared black and white photographs in my bed space and asked about my family. I rambled on about Aberdeen and playing practical jokes on Dossie. They asked who the pretty blonde was, the photo more worn than the others. The lovely Hazel. I thought of her and how we used to dance at the Palais des Dances. How she was the only girl who could keep up with my twinkling toes, now reduced to bloodied and mangled stumps. The orderlies tried to make me laugh, asking how far I got with Hazel, and I told them about our long walks through the dandelions of Duthie Park, how I would try to get her alone, those piercing blue eyes, all to myself. Florence Nightingale could not have faulted their patience and unwavering care. If I had given up hope, they never did. And by this time, I had very little hope left in me. The idea of suicide was a constant threat, not just for me, but for many men. Some gave in and threw themselves over the bridge or head first down the latrines. There was no doubt that clinical depression had muddied most of their minds. I just find that interesting, man. This girl, like, they weren't even dating for that long before we went to the war. It's just the power of romanticism and love in a man's heart. Quite literally in the time where he's about to die, she's part of the reason that he pulls through. I also think it's fascinating. Once again, an example of selflessness and generosity and love in action. These guys are all about to die too. These guys are not like it's not like they're much better off than him, but here they are trying to cheer him up and raise his spirit and lift his spirit. And as he says, if I had given up hope, they never did. They never gave up hope, and it allowed him, the little ember of hope that he had, they blew on it enough that it caught and gave him the fuel and the motivation and the desire to continue moving throughout this entire process of tragic prisonership. I mean, it's incredible. All right, the note I have here is rock bottom. Does it get worse? Cholera had been the final straw for my health, and I could no longer walk. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and gaping tropical ulcers that engulfed both ankles, and lower calves had been enough. But cholera finished me off. Mentally, losing control of my legs was too much. Either I was too damned weak or they were irreparably damaged, because no matter what my brain instructed them to do, I could no longer even move my legs. I was so devastated that I thought I may as well be dead. Having led such a full, active, and sporting life, losing my legs was worse than going blind for me. I had real fear that I would never again walk, and so depression set in. I could not see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, only blackness. So he's really going through it, as you can tell. I mean, this is some serious level of tragedy. And it's just a perspective shift. Like, this type of story to me, we all go through these times of down these seasons of depression, angst, sorrow, sadness, doubt, worry, fear. We all have those days. We all have those days where we feel sick. We all have those days where we feel helpless, blah, 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 blah. This is arguably as bad as a human being can experience life. He's literally treated like he is less than a human being, is eating a bowl of rice a day with maggots and lice in it. He's getting like a couple cups of water. He's doing manual labor for 16 or 14 hours a day in the blazing sun. He has no freedom. He's got cholera, beriberi, malaria, kidney stones, tropical ulcers, and dysentery. Every one of his friends is dying. He has no idea how his family's doing, whether or not they're alive, whether or not his friends are alive. He doesn't know that his family doesn't know that he's not alive. All these things. And yet, here they are, still chugging forward. They had the resolve enough to continue moving in the face of those circumstances. Man, is that a powerful perspective shift for us. Back to the word hope. Here's a little note. He's speaking of a guy named Weary Dunlop, which is he's a powerful character. He introduced order, fairness, record keeping, and above all, hope to Chung Kai. So Edmond Dantes is the main character of my favorite novel of all time, The Count of Monte Cristo. He has this quote that goes something like, all human wisdom is contained in these two words, wait and hope. I've already mentioned hope in this podcast, but I think Edmond Dantes there's some serious value in that sentiment, because into this Weary Dunlop character's credit, to be a man in this situation that people look to that provides hope, that's a powerful man. That's a powerful man, and that's an important man, because you have a choice. There's a song by a guy named Sam Barber and Avery Anna. One of the lyrics is like, just know that like wherever you go, there are two paths you can take. And in this context, I envision like you can be the guy that's draining hope and that's draining energy, that's saying, oh, we're doomed, it's screwed, like we're all going to die, blah, 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 which you can't really fault somebody in this situation for thinking that way. But you can also go the other way, where you're instilling hope and you're remaining optimistic and faithful and hopeful in the face of these circumstances, and that's contagious. Both are contagious, so we get to choose what contagion that we spread. Weary Dunlop was a character who spread the contagion of hope, which is a powerful thing to do as a man. Okay, so I wrote Hell on Earth here. I won't read all of it, but so if you remember back to what we were talking about with the train cars, all this happens. He's been a prisoner of war for however long, 2 years maybe, and the fighting for the Japanese is getting a lot more dire. They're realizing that, oh crap, we're losing this war. Americans and the Allies are getting closer to our home of Japan. So they start wanting more of the work to be centered or taking place in Japan. So they put these prisoners on Hell ships. Hell, Hell ships. And basically the Japanese, like the train cars, they put them in this hold of the ship, which is literally... they're in there like sardines again. They can't move. It's instead of 40 people in a train car, it's 450 dudes in a hole. People are dying. People are throwing up. People are peeing. People are pooping. People are dying on top of each other, laying on top of dead people. It's absolutely disgusting. They're in here for like 5 times and then 11 days. 5 days and 11 days or something like that. It's abject misery. There's no... It's just about as worse as it can be for a human being. And the Japanese, evil as they were, the Geneva Convention says that prisoner of war vehicles, I guess, or boats, vessels, they have to be painted with a big red cross, to like a Red Cross thing, so people know, the enemies know, okay, those are prisoners of war, we can't shoot them down. Well, they put the Red Cross on their oil tankers so that their oil tankers didn't get shot down by submarines or enemy ships. And then they left their prisoner of war ships completely unmarked, so that if the enemy shot anybody down, it would be their prisoners of war, which is just crazy. So they're in this hole. People are dying. Basically, simply said, the Americans they're traveling in a sizable armada, and the American Wolfpack is what it's called, which is a couple of I think it's 3 submarines. They shoot down some of these ships. I think it's like most of the ships in the armada. And That's where we get to the point that the excerpt that I opened with, where these guys are literally drowning, calling for their moms, calling for their children and their wives, saying daddy will be home soon, and then disappearing beneath the waves. Gone. Died. Done. Never to see their home, never see their friends again. And so, once again, to throw coals on a hot fire, or logs on a hot fire, let's do a brief recap. Alistair Urquhart was a prisoner of war for 2 years already. He had worked on the Death Railway. He had been on the Death March. He'd worked on the bridge on the River Kwai and Hellfire Pass. He had beriberi, kidney stones, cholera, malaria, tropical ulcers. He'd been eating rice and water 2 times a day for the last 2 years. All of his friends died. He almost died. He gets put on this hell ship, so he's literally experiencing a week or 2 weeks of abject desolation as a human being. It's not even comprehensible unless you've been in this position. And then it gets shot down. And so now he's just floating in the sea watching all his friends die. He's like, what the hell is going on? He ends up getting a single man raft. He's alone at sea for a bit. Then he gets picked up by another hell ship. So he gets back on a hell ship and gets taken to the Japanese mainland, I believe. And here's a note called, I said, unbroken. I was so burned and emaciated and ill that I staggered through the streets like a drunk. Some of the locals turned their backs on this terrible procession, but others jeered and spat at us. I was past caring. There must have been at least 100 of us. And then came an incredible and inspiring episode. As we stumbled along in the pouring rain, someone started singing. It was Singin' in the Rain. And slowly we all took up the song and joined in, singing a very rude version of the hit, complete with altered lyrics crudely deriding our Japanese captors. And I double underlined this. Even in this terrible condition, and after all we had been through, my comrades, ravaged by exposure, naked and in slavery, were defiant, their spirits unbroken. An unbroken spirit. This is what I'm talking about. The power of the human spirit is beyond our wildest imagination. 2 Timothy 1:7, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, says, "For God does not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control." This is that spirit in real time, being shown through the lives of these prisoners of war. They have not a single excuse that is unjustified to not be giving up. They have every single reason to be like, this is awful. I'm not going to be optimistic. I'm not going to continue going. I'm going to give up. But their spirits were unbroken, and that is a powerful lesson for us. If they can do it, then we can damn sure do it. He kind of glosses it over in the book. As I mentioned, he goes to... I forgot to mention this in the beginning. He goes to the mainland of Japan on his second hell ship or whatever. And he gets dropped off in this small coastal town. Or this small town. I don't know if it's coastal, to be honest. But small town called Nagasaki. And if you know anything about World War II or military or American or global history at all, you know that was the second city to get hit by an atomic bomb. So this guy, after everything that he just went through that we just went over, you throw that on top, he literally got hit by the blast of the atomic bomb in Nagasaki, which later in his life, he got cancer from. So this, I mean, it's just insane. Like, it's one thing after another, after another, after another. And it reminds me of the book of Job in the Bible. If you don't know the book of Job, I highly encourage you to go read it or to look up a video on YouTube or a podcast about it. It's basically about resilience in the face of a seemingly endless amount of tragic circumstances. And his life is very much so that way. Kind of glosses over it, but he doesn't get disintegrated, obviously. He was far enough away where he didn't just get disintegrated on impact of the bomb, but it's like he hits it, he almost falls over and all that stuff. So this is all that to say, they dropped the bomb. Japanese surrenders after the second bomb because they're like, holy shit, we can't do anything. There's actually interesting stories. This is kind of besides the point. There's interesting stories about why the Japanese surrendered to the Americans. Because the Russians were also coming from their west. We were coming from the east. Some people think that they were more afraid of the Russians, etc., blah, blah, blah. Nonetheless, they surrendered. Marines end up coming to free the prisoners of war. He gets on a ship, and there's this really cool paragraph to the book. As we sailed out of Nagasaki, I looked back at the devastation the militarist rulers of Japan had brought on their own country. Surveying that atomic wasteland to the big band sounds of Glenn Miller, was the defining moment of my life. The defining moment of his life. I'm trying to imagine his emotions. He had just been a prisoner of war for like 4 years, gone through every tragedy imaginable. Here he is on the other side of it, listening to a famous band, I guess Glenn Miller, on the deck of this ship as they're going to the Philippines or whatever. He's free. He's set free. He's no longer in captivity of this tyrannical military. I'm trying to imagine the emotions of that. I'm sure it was quite the experience. As he states, it's the defining moment of his life. Pretty wild. All right, so this is the first letter he writes home. I want to read the whole thing because I think it's pretty powerful. Hello, folks. This is your son, aged 26 years, coming to you by courtesy of the once Imperial Japanese Army. That's what they told you if they ever gave you anything. Well, I hope you're well and happy, and I hope looking forward to my homecoming as eagerly as I. It has been a long, troublesome, and heartbreaking period those last 6 years, but you and I have at last got a break, and well deserved, I think. There was little need to tell you as some of the stories are already in print, that we have been treated worse than pigs, but thanks to God, I am spared. At this point, let us pause for a few moments in memory of so many of my fine pals who helped me through in those days of torture in Thailand, but who were lost at sea on the journey to Japan. We left Nagasaki on the aircraft carrier Cape Gloucester and were transferred onto the ship at Okinawa, where we are en route for Manila, where we should arrive on 9/29/45. The experience of the last 3.5 years has taught me many lessons and hard ones. The crowning joy will be my arrival at the station at Aberdeen. Please give my kindest regards to my relations, and if any, to my friends of the pre-war years. Gee, it's going to be embarrassing trying to pick up the threads again, especially in my future job, whatever that may be. Mother, there is one person you have to thank more than anyone else in the world for my presence here now, and that is Hazel Watson. It appears that while I was lying in hospital at death's door, very ill with dysentery and beriberi, my pals had done everything they could to make me buck my spirits up and make a fight for it. But I must have been in a coma. I cannot remember much of what happened. However, they raked out my photographs, and as Hazel was the most prominent and most likely my girlfriend, they kept repeating her name and showing her photograph. They said it was not till 3 hours later that I seemed to recollect and began repeating her name over and over again, which was the turning point, as I gradually grew better day by day, weighing approximately 5 stone at the time. I think it's like 80 pounds. But please, Mother, keep this to ourselves, as I do not wish her to know, as it puts her and myself in an awkward position. I believe she is married, but I'm not sure. I have never managed to determine my feelings for Hazel, but it is sufficient that the thought of her pulled me together at the critical moment. I only wish that the fellows who looked after me then and gave me what little supplies of milk and eggs they risked their lives to steal off the Japanese guards had been spared for this day. Well, Mother, that is a terrible price of war, and we can only hope that there will never be another. Hoping this finds you as it leaves me. All the best. Love to all at home. Hoping to see you soon. Cheerio, your ever-loving son, Alistair. Dang. So, I mentioned Hazel several times. He even says it, self-proclaimed. She, the thought of her, the mere thought of the girl that he loved, was enough to pull him through at the critical moment. He was literally going to die, and he attributes her to the reason that he continued living. And it's also just a sad reminder of the sacrifice of these other guys. They gave him milk and eggs, and he's sitting here wishing that they got spared, which they didn't. Pretty profound letter, I would say. Okay, so add another log to the fire. He returns home to Aberdeen. It's a lackluster return. There's a lot of interesting conspiracies from the British Army. They, as far as I understand, they actually subdued a lot of the stories of their prisoners of war from the Japanese because they wanted to resume trade relations with the Japanese as quickly as possible. And I don't think they wanted their population to know how poorly that their prisoners of war were treated, because if they did know, they would likely not want to support trade with that nation. So, and there's just other bureaucratic nonsense in here about like prisoners of war not getting paid and having to pay for certain things and all this crap. It's absolute nonsense. All that to say, so he comes home to that, and he's actually at dinner his first night back in Aberdeen, here to the book. I asked about Hazel, and without looking at me, Mom said she had married during the war and moved to Canada. I was not upset. In fact, I was glad that she had moved on and seemed happy. Then Mom cleared her throat and told me nervously, "You should also know, Alistair, that your friend Eric didn't make it." I felt ill. I could barely lift my head, and the conversation buzzed around me. The words became jumbled, and I could no longer make them out. As the kitchen walls seemed to close in, it was like a bout of cholera, the claustrophobia enhanced by the cramped kitchen and the desperate shows of love and affection my poor family poured on me. He was killed on his first mission over Europe, Dad said. He was a rear gunner, a real brave soul. It was all too much, yet another kick in the face. Even though I had been around so much death, lived it and breathed it, nothing prepared me for the loss of such a close friend. All I could think was, why then am I still alive? By what miracle had I returned home? Suddenly I snapped. I slammed my fork down on Mom's finest crockery plate and stood up, the chair screeching on the wooden floor. The room felt silent. It was so unlike me to make a scene, completely out of character. I knew they were trying to help, but I just couldn't stand it. "I'm going out," I announced. I was already half out the door when a chorus of "I'll come with you and come back, Alistair" rang out. But I was off. I needed to be alone. My head felt like it was going to pop, and fresh air seemed the only answer. I walked and walked. Past the co-op and up Auchinleck Brae, I hardly broke stride. Before long, I was miles from home. Walking with purpose, but without forethought or direction. Aberdeen could not possibly have physically changed much during the war, but somehow I failed to recognize any of these surroundings. It all felt surreal and nothing seemed familiar. God knows where I walked, but I kept on going. Strolling without respite, even when it got dark, I kept on going and going, step after step, on my own enforced route march. I did not return home until around 5 o'clock the next morning. My parents were still up, obviously worried sick. As I crawled up the stairs to find a bed to lie down in, utterly exhausted, they asked where I had been. "We've been out looking for you," Mom pleaded, begging for information. "And all night," Dad chimed in. "We even called the police. What have you to say for yourself, son? It's freezing outside." I hated myself. I knew they were trying to be there for me, but I just wanted to be on my own. I had lived a solitary and sorry life for so long that love only suffocated me. So, just interesting. I mean, he comes home and it's obviously a joyous moment to see your family and all that, but the battle is in many ways still just begun. You can only imagine the lack of relatability, the lack of sociability, the lack of familiarity. It's just probably so much for a guy like that to deal with that he just hated himself, as he said, which is a tough place to be, as you can imagine. This is sad. So when he was in Singapore, there was 3 kids that were practically given to him for him to take care of. They were the sons of other military officers, I believe, and as the fighting got a little bit closer to where they were, they sent the kids to Alistair and said, "Hey, basically like use these kids as like apprentices and look at them." So he got very close with them. One of them in particular, Freddie, who was very charismatic, optimistic, jovial. He was liked by everybody. He was conniving in a way, so he would steal things from the Japanese guards. He would steal cigarettes. He would do all these things that got these soldiers to like him. He was very young. I think he was 14, 15, 16 at the time. And so this is a little bit of an indication of how hard it is to come back from a time like this, and it's also an indication of the power and importance of brotherhood. Okay. For the rest of his life, Freddie would phone me every night. No matter what was happening in either of our lives, he just wanted to talk. Always about the camps, which had left a fatal impression on him. He had to be checked into Roehampton Hospital several times, for a month or more at a time, and had even been granted a 24-hour telephone line to a psychologist. Yet he preferred to phone me and chew my ear off for an hour every night, sometimes 2 hours at a time. He got married to an Essex girl, Nora, whom he met through his church. But Freddie never came out of the camps, and he drank heavily to forget. Given his experience and his character, it should not have been a shock that he became an alcoholic. Despite the love he received from his wife, his family, and me and my family, he would die within 10 years of returning to the UK of cirrhosis of the liver. Still a young man. Pretty sure that means he basically drank himself to death. And it's just a sad thing, man. You go through all that, and he survives the camps just like Alistair did, and as he said, he never came out of the camps, and he drank heavily to forget but once again, it's hard to blame a guy, like how how can you and I sit here and judge a guy who's been through that, It's tough. But I do think it's an important note about brotherhood. He chose to call his brother and talk for an hour, 2 hours every night. Not the psychologist, not the hospital, not even his wife. He wanted to call his friend who had been through a similar thing that he has been through. Because shared adversity is how connection is built. And who else is going to relate to him? It's an interesting note for us. I think it's something we could think about with our friendships and who we speak to and how we navigate our friendships and relationships with our close friends, our brothers, and all those types of relationships. Because when somebody can look you in the eyes and understand what you've been through, it's different. Like if you're explaining something that doesn't resonate with somebody else, then there's only so much they can say that actually means something to you. But if somebody is speaking to you that has been through the same tumultuous circumstances that you've been through, there's a resonant love and appreciation and understanding that comes with that. I think it's a very powerful indication of the importance of brotherhood. And then to finish it, this is the last couple pages of the book. Very profound. My experiences at the hand of the Japanese continued to haunt me, both physically and mentally, as they still do all of these years later. Even after I got married, life could be hell. To this day, I suffer pain and nightmares can be so bad that I fight sleep for fear of the dreams that come with it. Yet I owed it to myself and to others who never made it back to make the most of my life. I threw myself into a career and worked my way up to become managing director of another plumbing supplies business, making health and safety a priority for the staff. After what I witnessed on the death railway, I enjoyed the work. My 2 children grew, and I took great pleasure from their success, as I did when my grandchildren came and when they went to university. Life continued to throw up challenges. After my wife Mary suffered a stroke, losing her power of speech, I nursed her for 12 and a half years, during which she was wheelchair bound. I think that the experiences I had on the railway and the inspirational example of our medics helped me to cope during that difficult period. At the age of 75, after Mary's death, I briefly immigrated to Canada to be close to my daughter, yet I found myself lonely and isolated in a strange country. I decided to return to Scotland. Through all of this, my sufferings as a prisoner taught me to be resilient, to appreciate life and all it has to offer. Back in Scotland, I quickly made new friends in the world of my lifelong passion, ballroom dancing. And at 90 years of age, I am still working on my slow foxtrot. I dance an average of 5 times a week and organize 2 weekly tea dances. I am a proud member of the Far East Prisoner of War Association and regularly answer the queries of families anxious to know how their grandfathers and fathers were treated. On behalf of the Far East Prisoner of War Association, I am very pleased to speak to school children about our experiences. My life has been long, rich, and rewarding, but always, the ghosts of the River Kwai have remained with me. The cruel faces of the Black Prince, Dr. Death, and the Mad Mongrel have stalked my dreams for more than 6 decades now. And in my thoughts and prayers, I will never forget the faces of all those young men who died looking like old men, those prisoners who endured terrible deaths in a distant land. I'm going to read that last paragraph again. My life has been long, rich, and rewarding, but always, the ghosts of the River Kwai have remained with me. The cruel faces of the Black Prince, Dr. Death, and the Mad Mongrel have stalked my dreams for more than 6 decades now. And in my thoughts and prayers, I will never forget the faces of all those young men who died looking like old men, those prisoners who endured terrible deaths in a distant land. It's difficult to explain the beauty of this man's life. And I mean beauty in the truest sense, because beauty is really a comparison of one thing and another, the state of one thing and another. And he lived the absolute trough of humanity. He was in the trough of humanity. Abject terror, horror, desolation. And to hear him in his 90-something year of life say, my life has been long, rich, and rewarding. He got through those times. And if he's able to do that, then so are you and I, because he's a fellow human being. He's a fellow man. He was able to make a long, rich, and rewarding life, even though the ghosts of the River Kwai remained with him, even though he wanted to kill himself at one point, even though he was almost killed by cholera, even though he was almost killed by Japanese imperialists, even though all his friends died in the camps, even though his best friend back home died, even though the love of his life went to Canada and got married, even though his wife died and couldn't speak for 12 years, even though his best friend Freddie died after 10 years of being home, even though all these things, this negative thing, he was able to find long, rich, and rewarding life through those things. There is no better perspective shifting story that I've read recently, at least, other than that of Jesus Christ, that gives me more hope. He is a living example of the power of hope and resilience and the power of the human spirit. It's a phenomenal book. I cannot recommend that you get it enough. It's an easy read. It's only like 300 pages. Yeah, 300 pages. Read it in a weekend or a week if you really wanted to. Very easy to read. So compelling that it's very hard to put down. You want to just continually read. I cannot recommend it enough. There'll be a link in the show notes to buy the book through Amazon. That's an affiliate link. It'll give me a very, very tiny percentage at no cost to you. All that said, that's The Forgotten Highlander, Alistair Urquhart, an incredible World War II story of survival in the Pacific. I sincerely hope that this book has impacted you and that you get the chance to read it and take stock of the lessons and the perspective that it adds to your life. That's where I'll leave it. Y'all have a good one.